Okay, and now that we've kind of laid out some of the general idea of thinking with historical concepts in mind, I'd like to dive right into the first lesson if I could. Our first lesson, which deals with colonial and Columbian exploration during this time period here. And so, the first Americans. Who are our first Americans? We hinted a little at this when we were talking in our pre-lesson about the first and second rule of history. Our first Americans were not European in nature. Our first Americans were Asian in terms of their backgrounds, and at least where they come from. How they got here was both intentional and accidental in many ways. You're looking at a group of people that came over here as a migratory hunting bands coming across during the Great Ice Age. Now, when you're coming across during the Ice Age, as they were, you've got to understand these people, these civilizations, these groups that were coming, were not aware of the fact that they were moving to a new world. They knew where they were going in the sense they were going to new territories, but they were following migrating game herds. They weren't conscious of the fact that they were going to emerge into new continents in the process. How they got there is something you're probably somewhat familiar with from much of your history from middle school on, crossing what was referenced as the land bridge. Today, the Bering Strait is a very narrow patch of water between the two continents, the Asian landmass and North America. A couple millennia ago, during the Ice Age, a great deal of the Earth's water was locked up in these massive ice sheets. To give you an idea and context on that, for instance, if you live around the Great Lakes area today, if you live around the Chicago area, wherever you're sitting in your room or whatever, look straight up. Above you would have been a mile-thick sheet of ice. That's the kind of water that was locked up inside these massive glaciers that were over the northern hemispheres. As such, either this area was solid ice, or the sea levels had receded because so much of the water was tied up in this ice that there was actual bare land for animals and game to cross, and then the Native American, or the tribal groups that are nomadically hunting were crossing that land as well. So as they came across, over the next couple thousand years, they gradually spread and worked their way over the millennia through all the way from the northern part of North America all the way down to Tierra del Fuego down in South America, spreading around into hundreds if not thousands of different civilizations, hundreds if not thousands of different language groups. And for the most part, you saw initially tribal settlements in a semi-nomadic pattern of 300 to 500 for the most part. And in North America, that's going to be the dominant feature. There will be some exceptions, but you've got to understand the cultural diversity that we're talking about. You have no one set Native American pattern of culture, language, creation stories, religious worldview, etc. There's some general patterns we can look at overall to say, here's some general themes, but if you get specific, your generalizations will tend to break down a little bit. In terms of cultural diversity, there's no dense populations or complex nation states north of Mexico that we're going to be seeing and looking at in our experience for U.S. history. Some of the examples of the kind of lifestyles you'd see, for instance, you would have the Sioux, who would be some of the Plains Indians we see out here in the High Plains, Great Plains area, lived a nomadic lifestyle, even prior to the Spanish coming and bringing in the introduction of the horse. The Pueblo of the Southwest, Pueblo is Spanish, I believe, for home, who built small structures, small brick and mud type structures that were actual residences and homes and communities. And then, of course, over here in the eastern United States, the Mississippian or the Hopewell or woodland cultures of the American Trans-Mississippi Basin. Of these, you had the mound builders who lived in Cahokia, the Mississippian mound builders near East St. Louis, Illinois today, who had a civilization, a community of probably perhaps 30,000 within their town. And the most complex of the political organizations you would have seen in North America would have been the Iroquois, which is made up of actually 6 subsetted tribes who combined in what you would call a political confederacy. This represented, in North America, the most unified and combined front of Native American life and culture that the Europeans found upon their arrival with that they had to contend with. In terms of daily life, you're talking about a group of people who lived largely at this extended tribal clan level for the most part in North America. As we said, 300 to 500. In terms of gender roles, you're looking at gender roles that were delineated. Men and women had specific tasks, but unlike the European model, there was not a set of social values placed on their tasks. For instance, in the European worldview, the European model, men and women did different things, and by extension, the things that the men did because of who they were in the European worldview made the men superior, better than the women who were subservient to them in all political and social aspects. For the Native Americans, daily life meant both men and women had to contribute their tasks. Men involved in things like leadership roles, hunting, diplomacy, trade with exterior tribes, things that got them beyond the periphery of the tribal zone. Women involved in child care, preparation of the goods for harvest, agriculture, the skinning and taking care of the animals, or taking care into the component parts of the animals that the men would bring back from the hunt and return. Each gender's contributions was equally respected and valued, because if one's, it's like a footstool. If you take off the pillars on one side, the stool falls down. Within Native American cultures, as such, both the contributions of men and women were equally valued to that regard. Now, to transition a little bit then into the great empire civilizations, with the Europeans arriving, and your next slide is going to show you the three main Native American civilizations that Europeans encountered upon their discovery, note that they are not, for the most part, in North America. You're talking in Central and South America is where these major civilizations were. You had the Aztecs of northern Mexico and Central America, the Mayans of far more centrally Central America, and then the Incans, largely what we'd see in South America and modern-day Peru. Now, the reason we call these civilizations is because they had all the characteristics, if you will, the elements of civilization that every civilization has, that historians, archaeologists, anthropologists have determined that all civilizations have these key building blocks. What are these building blocks? Common language, specialization, in other words, what we call division of labor within the society. Not everybody does everything for their own sustenance and survival that has to make themselves sustain and survive. Calendar, time measurement. Tied in closely with that is agriculture, the ability to cultivate crops, which allows you to have permanent settlements, as opposed to having to follow the nomadic game patterns going wherever the food is. Tool making and usage, and then governance and law. As such, the civilizations that you saw in Central and South America had all the hallmarks of a complex civilization that you'd have seen of their European counterparts of this time period and before this time period. For instance, the Aztecs, with their capital city at Tenochtitlan, was as large, if not larger, than any major European city, including London, Rome, Paris, of this time period, had all the kind of complex intricacies that you would see of a city life and a city model of social living. To transition now to our next step, let's go ahead and look then. We've seen North and South America. We've seen the Native American experiences. Let's look at Europe, if we can, on the eve of exploration during this time period, which means we're going to transition to a separate visual aid for you all. This map here shows you Europe at the dawn of oceanic exploration. The darkened areas you see represent the known world to Europe during this time. You can see, obviously, the land bridge that we referenced in our first part of Lesson 1, not even on their radar at this point in time, not even something that's visually apparent to them in many ways. If you wanted to have a quick shorthand, I guess, to look at European motivations for exploration, it's incomplete, but it's useful as a line of departure. Think the 3 Gs. What was going to drive the Europeans to go explore worldwide? It's a helpful study tip for you to start. Gold, glory, God. The 3 Gs. That's a good place to start for you in terms of getting some knowledge and getting some understanding of their reasons for why they were doing what they were doing at this point in time. With the Crusades, if we can get more specific down our list a little bit further, we'll use the Crusades as our jumping off point for European exploration. At the end of the several hundred-year period of the Crusades, the Europeans were frustrated in their attempt to secure what they desperately wanted, which was Jerusalem and the Holy Land, to be reclaimed for Christianity and Christ as they saw it. After several invasions and attempts to conquer these areas, they've been thrown out successively by various waves of Islamic resistors to this point in time. Not only were the Europeans evicted, but Islam then proceeded to take over most of the Holy Land area, most of North Africa, worked their way across modern-day Turkey, almost up to Vienna today, modern-day Austria, and also across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and worked their way halfway up the Iberian Peninsula of Spain. So these crusades resulted in the Europeans attempting in many ways to throw back and evict these infidels, as they saw them, these unholy believers, from their own continent, let alone resecure the Holy Land. However, through their contact with the Holy Land, through the Great Crusades and the times that they'd spent there when they did have significant long-term occupations, they came in contact with other cultures, they came in contact with other trade goods and items that they sought and desired, whether it was silks, spices, perfumes, etc. And so you saw a desire for trade. This leads them to a significant drawback. They wanted to trade with the goods of the Far East. As you can see, they've got a giant roadblock there. Here's Europe. Here's the central area dominated by the forces of Islam. here's the area they want to get to, which is going to, for economic purposes, which is going to lead them to have to do one of two things that are really not desirable for them. Either A, they're going to have to do without these trade goods entirely because the Islamic peoples are going to see themselves in a state of war against these hostile Europeans, or B, they're going to have to trade with these guys, the Islamic people of this area, in order to get these goods over here. So the Ottoman Turks, the Moors, all these Islamic cultures were going to serve as their middlemen. And as middlemen, they were going to make profits. They're going to jack up their prices. The Moors and the Islamics, the Ottomans, were going to jack up their prices for goods that they got from the Far East, took here, and then sent to Europe for a markup. Europe kind of wants to eliminate the middleman and get these goods direct. That's their intention at this point in time. As such, on this map, the known world to the Europeans should begin to sort of make sense to you. If they can't go through, they're going to try to go around. From Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator began sending exploration ships for navigational purposes, working further and further and further down the coast of Africa. And just at the point of discovery of the New World, Portuguese explorers had rounded the Horn of Africa and realized this continent finally has an end. It heads up that way. So they were trying to find their way to work around this middleman that they did not choose to deal with. Columbus's arrival in the West, in the New World, represents merely another extension of this thinking. We can either go down the map or we can go across it. No reasonably thinking European at this point thought that the world was flat, that you would simply go over the side if you got to the end of the known world. That's sort of an over-exaggerated stereotype of mythology. No learned European who was engaged in navigation or shipbuilding or map-making this time thought this. However, their calculations on how large the Earth was and what was going to be beyond the Azores and their known world here were significantly off. There's two giant speed bumps to this trip that they want to take going straight across to the Indies. Those speed bumps are not on this map. It's North and South America. And they're going to find their worldview is abruptly going to be wakened up by that. Going along with this, as Europe emerges from the Middle Ages, emerges from the time of the Crusades, you have the period of the Renaissance, which is a period of a rebirth and explosion in knowledge and communication and learning in Europe during this time. And there's an awful lot of tools that come into use that bring a confluence of events together. European cultures are being destabilized. You have the advent of technological resources that can help out. The Europeans borrow various technologies from around the world and apply them for more as they sought utilitarian and straightforward purposes. For instance, they borrow gunpowder from the Chinese. Gunpowder makes its way as a technology to Europe. The Chinese largely had utilized it as for rockets, firecrackers, and entertainment purposes. The Europeans realize it can be used as they come up with the idea it can be utilized as a weapons delivery system, and they introduce firearms to the world as such. You also, during this time, have the invention of the printing press. The printing press becomes the World Wide Web, the internet of its day. It allows for the Europeans from all around their continent and information they took from elsewhere to be consolidated, distributed, and disseminated throughout the continent, and knowledge can then be traded, shared, and swapped back and forth and grown on this permanent record. So scientific and advancement discovery, there are improvements in compass and map making, which is very important in terms of trade, or in terms of travel and trade. You got to be able to get to where you're going to get to. And also, more importantly, get yourself successfully back. Advances in shipbuilding were also going to need for more deep water, blue ocean-going vessels that could sustain the kind of trips and travels the Europeans wanted to make during this time. So the combination of the Renaissance and these technological advances that come about as a result of it are going to play key roles in this origins of European exploration.